Hey everyone, just making another video. So I'm trying to make these videos about some of the rationales to have some governance education material. I'm part of the Intersect Constitution Council for the Interim Constitution, but we have agreed that we as members can of course discuss rationales, but when we do it's as a single person, and we would clearly state if we are talking as the council itself, and what I'm saying is my personal opinions, and it's not binding in anything in terms of our rationale, but it's more for me to share some of my thoughts, and I try to keep it fairly neutral in how I comment it and just raise things for the community to think about. I think that's a good thing to do. So let's start off. So Cardano ikigai. This is an info action, an info governance action, and it was voted abstain by Cardano Atlantic Council and Eastern Council, and Cardano Foundation, Japan Council, and Interset voted approve, and American IOG did not vote. The D-reps voted fairly yes, 41%, and no, 4.64 million, and many did not vote, and some have a default vote to no confidence. So of active voters, quite a lot voted yes, and the same you could say about the majority of SPOs, who actually voted overwhelmingly positive, I would say, of the active SPOs. So why did in this rationale we end with a yes vote? I will try to run through some of the logic here. So we're trying to follow this standard where we first interpret the facts. I think this is something to be aware of, or at least think about. Like anytime you are interpreting something, you do have a level of subjectivity, because you need to say something about how you understand the facts, and there could be nuances in how you understand the facts, and I think it's important to be upfront about those, and that is a reason why in this structure we tend to start with understanding of the facts. And in this particular action, we understand the facts that is valid per the technical standards proposal, both in terms of the article that talks about this special form of governance action, info action, as of community sentiment, and also this Article 3, Section 6, that talks about some of the requirements for any governance actions. And in terms of those, it's valid. It has a URL, a hash, and a language tag. Then in this actual case, it raises an interesting point, because the proposal is in Japanese, and we also have to establish some facts in terms of what languages we are using. So we discuss here that the Interim Constitution, to make it accessible, it's been translated to several languages, and in the instructions of those versions, they say that only the version that matches the on-chain hash is the official Cardano Constitution, and the official hash of the Interim Constitution is currently in English. So that is what was used to judge this proposal, the English version of the Constitution. So in the case where there's only one official constitution in English, and it makes sense, I believe, to judge it in that constitutional language, even if it's a Japanese proposal. And then what is the proposal? So they establish it's in Japanese. It's a supporting language with a ZIP100 language tag, and it seems to be Arabic, Bengali, and 20 languages. And there's a supporting material in English that translates to the Japanese proposal. So based on this, It's the understanding of the concept that it's about the gratitude and respect to IAG, a merger on Quran Foundation, acknowledging that they brought Quran to the world and that embodies the essence of ikigai, a sense of purpose or reason of being, and pledge that the current community will build on this foundation with such a common sense of purpose and with collectivist passion and energy. And we interpret that to be an expression of community sentiment and basically polling others if they are in agreement with that sentiment. And we also say that we interpret it to not have any direct effect either off-chain or on-chain. So we believe it's info action that is very clearly, as in Article 3, Section 5, a special form of governance action that's meant for community sentiment. Then we look at the actual constitutionality. So we are not like interested in this particular case in the expressed sentiment. We don't, as we understand it, there's nothing here that's in violation. Like, I think it would be very typical for communities, if they are Japanese or if they are Hindi, French, Italian. Of course they will be expressing sentiments, and of course there will be a varied many types of cultures and expressions in the Cardano ecosystem. We are going to be an infinite amount of communities, and we should all be able to use that info action. So far so good. It's only a problem if the sentiment in some way violates the constitution itself. So in the previous rationale we discussed if, for example, expressing something could violate some the whole legitimacy of the constitution itself by, for example, having violated human rights in the terms of naming something. And there could probably be examples where there are some principles in the constitution that makes you want to step in at the sentiment. But in general, and the permit of the Constitutional Council is to judge the constitutionality. So only when the sentiment somewhat touches on the constitution itself and the constitutionality should the CC, I think, if you follow this logic, be able to step in and vote on it. So that is what's being voted on here, is the constitutionality in terms of requirement for such an info action. And then there's some questions. A, does an info action that declares itself to be having no intended effect on-chain or off-chain, is that something the interested country should vote on, even only in terms of constitutionality? So should the Constitution Committee even bother to look at such an info action if there's no intended effect on-chain or off-chain? The other question relates to that there's so many languages in the supporting material, and that there's also Japanese language used for the governance action itself. So that raises the principal question if constitutionality of info action in multiple languages and in other languages than the official hash version of the interim constitution. So are these type of info actions constitutional if they are in multiple languages and with supporting material in various languages and the main info action in another language than the constitution? So the first question, should we vote on this when it declares itself to have no intended on-chain or off-chain effect? This is a nuanced debate, and there's many arguments there. In the view here, as in the rationale, we're discussing the first section of the Article 6, looking at the duties of the Constitutional Committee. So the limit is that the Constitutional Committee shall be limited to voting on the constitutionality of governance actions. And the Constitutional Committee shall comprise a set of Eiderholds that collectively responsible for ensuring that on-chain governance action prior to enactment on-chain are constitutional. So the question then is, in info action are not enacted on the chain, so are they even valid to vote on? So that's a question of the textual interpretation. So A, prior to enactment could be interpreted to mean that only actions that are going to be enacted should be judged for the constitutionality. It could also mean that any governance action could be judged, but the criteria is that the judgment should happen prior to enactment. So that is not an exclusiveness that it has to be enacted to be able to vote on. And then if there are two conflicting translations, in conflicting interpretations in this. What should you guide yourself to? I think you first look at the support around this sentence. So in the first sentence, it shall be limited to voting on the constitutionality of governance actions. So clearly, it seems to mean all governance action. And then in Article 3, Section 5, they define infraction as a special form of governance action. So this seems to pull in for the sense that you should be able to vote in the infraction. And also from like a logical and consistency standpoint, it will make sense for the Constitutional Committee to be able to vote on all infractions. We are able to vote on them, and there's limitation described for these governance actions. So infraction is defined, it's a special form of governance action exists to allow community sentiment to be gauged. So for example, if infractions are used for something else than to allow community sentiment to be gauged, then probably we should be able to vote on that and say that this is against the Constitution because it's defined what the special form of governance action is. It's also a problematic, that was discussed in the previous rationale for the Hoskar report, that you have some info actions that have an effect on other actions. A budget info action is such an example. So the budget is passed first as an info action before there's a treasury withdrawal, and there's even a must guardrail in the guardrail of the Constitution related to this budget info action. So if we're not able to vote on that info action, we would be hard locked out of being able to perform our duty on voting on those constitutionality requirements of those budget acts that's in the guardrail. So again, from a logical and consistency standpoint, this interpretation could make sense. And also, just for for example, what's the essence of this Article 3, Section 5 and 6? Well, I would say in Article, if you look at it, so if you look at this section, it's really about ensuring that this infraction is something that's easily readable and that you can't change the documentation on it. That's why you have the hash. So for me, that's all about like making it transparent and making it so that it's not something you can manipulate, as is said here, or being undue influence through. And for me, it makes sense to also make all infractions have that type of protection, because if not, as I discussed in another video, you would have the problem of polls that just can be changed in last minute, and I don't think we should be doing that. Like, that ruins the effectiveness and legitimacy of those polls, and they should be held up to these standards of having the hash not changed for any supporting material to such infractions, for example. So in short, like, it's a logical and consistency standpoint, it could make sense to interpret it this way, that also it's not exclusive to only enacted actions, but actions before enactment. So that's how we conclude that we are able to judge this on its constitutionality. We're already established that we believe it's per the facts, that it's per the technical standards, is a valid infraction. So in this case, the only thing left is like more of a principle question, and why we also want to write a rationale on this. And I think this is something to really consider for the community as well. Is basically how we treat languages in terms of how we make our governance system. We say there's not directly said anything in the Constitution about requirements for language. So we then turn ourselves to the principles, and there's a principle of openness. And we believe that this also has to be held about to the technical capabilities, so that you are able to fulfill that governance is both open and transparent for the whole ecosystem. And we define this as a question of accessibility. So on the one hand, it's in the first article, in the first section, it's an expression of a principle, we have this principle of openness. We want the blockchain to be open for everyone. At the same time, we have all of these rules that talk about our capabilities, our tooling, and all of them are part of making sure that we uphold all of the other important principles, such as having transparency, as an example. And that becomes then a question of, on one hand, making sure it's open for anyone, permissionless, and making sure it's accessible for everyone, so you're able to collaborate, basically. So we then look at where this is expressed. It's expressed about the participatory governance, that all Cardano community members are beneficiary of the interim constitution and entitled to its rights, privilege, and protection. And this is an expression of globalization of the Cardano interim constitution as it relates to the Cardano blockchain. And we say that the Cardano blockchain is for everyone, no matter their race, birthplace, or language spoken. So this is an expression of the fact that the Cardano community members are the beneficiaries of the interim constitution. All of them. That's why it's globalization. But then we argue, for true globalization, you need accessibility for any consensus to form in a global blockchain. Because you can imagine a world where people are only talking in their bubble, they're not able to talk to each other. That does not create a true global ecosystem of communities within communities. So accessibility needs to be held to the standards of what the governance ecosystem is capable of. The burden of making governance action open and transparent lies upon the proposer of governance actions, so the one who submits it, basically. It's a collective decision-making process with a consensus threshold as described in Article 3, Section 3. So we establish the principle, it's open, but then there are some duties that we all are part of. On-chain governance shall be made through a collective decision-making process with specific consensus threshold requirement. So imagine again, like globalization. If it's truly globalization, and if it's truly going to be a collective decision-making process, you need to have accessibility, right? Because if not, you're not able to communicate with each other, and you are not able to reach a more global voting threshold on something. Like you might have a local community voting something, but if it's not accessible, then it's not possible for the whole of the ecosystem to vote on that, and that will damage its legitimacy in terms of voting on things that affects everyone in the ecosystem. So we say that it's important that the proposer makes sure it's accessible. Without accessible consensus threshold described in the collective decision-making process, you could lose legitimacy and overall transparency could decrease. So again, like it's harder than for the community to actually understand the proposal, and harder than to hold them accountable to it, and overall the transparency could decrease. Thirdly, the standards for what the community is capable of making accessible might evolve over time as tooling and processes enable more accessibility through translation. We could probably imagine a future where AI translation gets so good that it's not even a problem anymore with language. So, and it's expressed several places in the Constitution. The use of tooling to help facilitate governance is expressed multiple places in the interim Constitution, such as for the Constitutional Committee in Article 6, Section 5, and the community creates off-chain processes as necessary to ensure awareness of an opportunity to debate and shape all future governance action. This is expressed in Article 3, Section 7. So not only tooling, but creating off-chain processes as necessary to ensure awareness of an opportunity to debate and shape all future governance action. So it's up to us as a community to develop both the tooling and the processes to make governance more and more accessible, so we reach our principal goal of making Cardano as open as possible. So having established that it's a question of accessibility, we then ask, is the infaction accessible? So we establish English is the official version of the Cardano interim constitution, and therefore any infaction being considered in governance will need to be examined in English for comparison to the constitution. And in this specific case, the tooling to understand the proposal was sufficient, because while the text was written in Japanese, it matched to an English translation in the supporting material. And also, the severity of getting this wrong is not as high because the inf action has no effect on subsequent actions and states that it does not directly or indirectly request any specific changes within the Cardano ecosystem, either off-chain or on-chain. And here again, because of this, it's only a question if the sentiment is sufficiently accessible both in the inf action itself, but also a question if the supporting material is accessible as well. So we establish it has to be a question of accessibility. We then look at the inf action if it's accessible and say that we both need to look at the inf action itself, but also the supporting material. We established that we're able to match Japanese to the English translation, so we have an understanding from the supporting material of what the inf action is. So then we ask, is an inf action that is supporting material in multiple other languages sufficiently accessible? And then we raise a point that it could be a problem with conflicting translation in supporting material. And if we interpret this standardized and legible format as a requirement in Article 3, Section 6 as both wider than just a technical standard, but also related to the actual language, then it's basically a question if it's in a legible or readable format. And we argue that for governance action with on-chain effects, such as parameter changes, you risk having difference across translation in the supporting material, and the same risk is related to inf action that has an effect on subsequent actions, such as the budget inf action. And here, this has potential for misunderstandings or hurting transparency. And we established that we don't need this strict standard here because in this case the inf action has no on-chain effect as the understanding of facts of the interstate console. Then we raise another issue that community sentiment inf action should be open and transparent. That should be an open and transparent process that's protected from undue influence and manipulation. That's the requirement in the Article 3, Section 6 in the end of it, if you look here. That all the holders should have the right to ensure the process of participating, submitting, and voting on governance action is open and transparent, is protected from undue influence and manipulation. So, one can imagine a sentiment poll with nuances in the different languages, supporting material, causing undue influence or manipulation, even at the level of a community being gauged on different sentiments or topic. So, here we say that there is some standard even for now just a community sentiment poll, and it doesn't have any on-chain effect and it doesn't affect the subsequent action, but the poll itself, like if it's undue influence or manipulation. So as an example of that would be like in English it says one thing in a poll and in another language it says something completely different, and this causes an effect in how the polling is done, and the community is not really voting on the same thing. And we argue then that it can't be judged too strictly. Because even if it's in one language, it can be judged differently by how people read the proposal. So if there's like slight nuances and it's just a poll and it's slight nuances in English versus say in Swahili, but the overall sentiment is the same, and it's just more of how the different languages expresses the thing, then it's really polling the same thing, and you cannot vote this too strictly because that's would mean that the constitutional committee stepped into something very highly subjective. So we also argue that it should be more strictly relative to the balance necessary between openness and transparency compared to the possibility of manipulation or influence on governance action. And again, if it's more like the consequences are greater, such as the budget proposal inf action that has effect on future treasury withdrawals, will likely require a higher degree of accessibility and transparency given the effects it will have on the Cardano community. Polls of community sentiments are of less risk to the community as they may not bind future actions. Again, this is slightly hard to say, and it's true, but we don't know how info action polls will be used in the future. So based on our current understanding, it's probably less risky because if it doesn't have any on-chain or off-chain effect, it's likely just a community sentiment poll, and if it's small nuances between the different languages, that's probably the same as even inside a single country with different dialects. Of course, there are some nuances at that level of subjectivity is fine. It's part of normal communication. The problem is when you're doing something misleading or manipulative. And then we also discussed precedent discussion that in the SIP 694 they use English, and there's a practice from SIP 1 that it's no requirement to have English, but it's an ISO 639 code of the target language being used, and and having this can be seen as an expression of openness that is even in the SIP, not English per se the requirement, but it's more about having like a source language, original source language, versus being the translated material. Such as understanding what is a source material versus supporting translation material. And in the counter-argument, some of the counsel means that we are stepping too much into subjectivity and we're not voting what's constitutional in nature. Again, this is more of a principle of, is it the process for info action that we should vote on, such as in this case, like is it sufficiently accessible, is it following the standards in Article 3, Section 6 in forms of standardized and legible format and so on, or are we voting on something subjective? And the majority is arguing that we are not voting on the subjective, we are only voting on the constitutionality in terms of requirement for such an info action. And that argument is pretty much the same as what I read from the Cardano Foundation argument as well in their rationale. But yeah, for everyone to discuss, like, is it okay to say that there is a standard that is required to have some form of accessibility, not establishing that per se English must be the language, but that the language of governance proposal has to be accessible, so that it's not so for example, you're not voting on a budget info action in just one part of the community because the other communities do not understand sufficiently the proposal. And I think if you think carefully about that, you might end up with the same conclusion, that we do need some form of accessibility, and the standards for that accessibility needs to be higher when it's something that truly reflects all of the community. And sometimes when it's an info action that's a sentiment maybe related to parts of the community and it doesn't affect others, maybe the standards for accessibility should be lower. In any case, I hope that was useful, and see you another video hopefully.